Hello, this is Philip, your host again, and today we're going to do first a reading, and then I'm going to create another video about the reading. The reading isn't entirely essential, but it's about judging. Actually, the title of the essay is called Judge Not? ? Should we judge or should we not? And in this essay by Jean Bethke Elshtain examines the platitude that we should not judge other people and gives reasons for thinking that we are not only permitted to make moral judgments but have an obligation to do so. This is quite different from what we see in our society today. Anyway, I'll get the reading done and then we can break this down, and I'm curious what the viewers have to think about it too. I'm open to all responses and reactions, even negative ones. Alright, so let's begin. We are a society awash in exculpatory strategies. We've devised lots of fascinating ways to let ourselves off the hook. All one need do is think of the recent well-publicized trials to appreciate the truth of this. We Americans are at present being bombarded with sensationalistic tales of victimization and equally sensationalistic proclamations of immunity from responsibility. Alternatively, bemused and troubled by the Oprah Winfreyization of American life, I sometimes think of my grandmother. Dear grandmother, may she rest in peace, knew how to judge. She was tough as nails on people she found despicable or merely wanting. She chewed them out in her Low German dialect, being a vulgar German. Hochdeutsch was not her tongue, and we grandchildren could figure out a thing or two. We knew when she was describing someone as swinish or dirty, these being ways to characterize those who stole from others, beat their wives or their livestock, or abused their children. Women, of course, could be abusers too. We missed a good bit of her amusements, though, as it was the policy of my grandmother, my mother, and aunts Mary and Martha not to teach us Plattdeutsch. Sorry for my German here. When grandmother was really on a roll and wanted nothing less than to condemn someone to perdition, her favorite judging word was Ruski. Hearing it sent a frisson through our tender flesh and bones. The last time I heard her say this, I was 43 or 44 years old, and it still frightened me. Not quite out of my wits, but I remained convinced, as I had been since the age of 5 or 6, when I had acquired some inkling of what was at stake, that the person was doomed, no two ways about it. Ruski was her shorthand judgment of the variety garden cheat, the ordinary bum, the farmer who shortchanged his hired hands, or the mother who kept her kids in dirty clothes, let their noses run, and never washed their hair. Why Ruski as a term of judgment? That was a historic overdetermination. It was the Russians who had begun to undermine the historic immunities of the Volga German communities. Under Tsar Nicholas, on the throne when my grandparents' families emigrated to the new country, from what my grandmother always called the old country, their sons were being drafted into the Russian army, and they were so fearful that they hid their Bibles in secret places. I suppose my grandmother would be a good candidate for sensitivity training. She is beyond the reach of the enthusiasts of pop psychology with its quivering non-judgmentalism. Having died at the age of 94, 2 years ago, but it gives me a shiver of another sort, one of delight, to imagine a confrontation between grandma and a facilitator, eyes agleam with programmed goodness, saying things like, "Now, Miss Lind, why do you feel that way?" Or, "Don't you think that's a little harsh? Have you considered how hurtful such words can be?" Probably the facilitator would want to take a good look at my mother, and in addition to Aunts Mary and Martha, Uncle Bill and Uncle Ted, too, no doubt damaged beyond repair, having been reared by such a no-nonsense judger. Good luck. I doubt they would have the slightest inkling of what she was going on about. There was no room in the family idiom for evasions of responsibility, and you would find yourself the subject of assessment of a rather decisive sort if you tried one. No doubt from time to time my grandmother and her children rushed to judgment. I know my sisters and brothers and I sometimes wished Mom wouldn't embarrass us in public by being so, decisive in her assessment of things. More than once delivered up in front of those being assessed, too. I recall wanting to seek the nearest exit on more than one occasion. But then I thought, even at the time, better this than someone agreeable and eternally smiling, like my nemesis, the mother of Judy Belcher, not her real name, who was a pal to her daughter. They talked about everything, especially boyfriends and fashion. They liked to have fun together. I found this pretty disgusting. I still do. Judging seems to run in the family. But to say this is not to say much. For what is at stake is the capacity to make judgments as an ethical issue of the gravest sort, and along it, the discernment of what it means to judge as well. In other words, we need a clear sense of why judging is important, and what is involved in the activity of judging, and we need a way to distinguish between rash judging, not judging well, and the kind of judging that lies at the heart of what it means to be a self-respecting human subject in a community of other, equally self-respecting subjects. Judging has been in bad odor for some time in American culture. It is equated with being punitive or insensitive or various phobias and isms. It is the mark of antiquated ways of thinking, feeling, and willing. Better, no doubt, to be something called open-minded, a trait thought to be characteristic of sensitive and supportive persons. A young woman well known to me that she and her fellow teachers at one of the elite New York public high schools were enjoined not to make students feel bad by being too decisive in their assessments of student work and effort. I breathed a sigh of recognition when she told me this. It is the sort of thing one hears in the higher reaches of the academy, too. In fact, this attitude is everywhere, even on bumper stickers. At least some of the readers of this essay will have cited a bumper sticker that reads, "A mind is like a parachute. It works best when it is open." Yes, indeed, one wants to counter the more open, meaning the more porous and thin, the better. A rather more convenient way of being in the world than being called to discriminate in the old, best sense of the word. An open mind of the sort celebrated by the bumper sticker may signify an empty head, a person incapable of those acts of discernment we call judging, one who is, in fact, driven to see in such acts mere prejudice. But prejudice and judgment are two very different human possibilities. Indeed, the more we proliferate prejudices, free from the scrutiny of that discernment we aim to evade, the less capable we are over time of making judgments. An example or two, in line with Kant's insistence that examples are the go-kart of judgments, may suffice. When I first began university teaching, in 1973, I taught a course called Feminist Politics and Theory. I taught it for several years until I decided the tumult was too much to put up with the semester after semester. One problem I encountered went like this. I had designed the course as a sustained exercise in assessing and critically contrasting competing feminist accounts of culture and politics. I asked my students to engage certain questions that presupposed their capacity for judgment. What sort of picture of the human condition is presented by this theorist? Could her prescription for change be implemented? How? What would the world look like if it were so? And so on. But I ran into trouble straight off. For in the eyes of many of my students, what I was supposed to be doing was condemning that big booming abstraction, patriarchy, for 50 minutes 3 times a week. I was supposed to embrace, not criticize, feminist doctrines, all of them, even though the ideas of the radical separatist feminists scarcely comported with those of liberal feminists on many issues. Needless to say, the Marxist feminist and the eco-feminist didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things either. Students sometimes showed up in my office bereft and troubled. One told me she had been a feminist since she was 14 and didn't need to hear feminism criticized. Another told me she was so upset by my criticism of the text of a feminist who proposed test tube reproduction and a world run by beneficent cyber engineers, and so shocked at my insistence that she respond to a series of questioning, asking her to sift, discriminate, and assist assessed this text and others, and she had complained to and sought refuge in a support group at the Women's Center. Yet another refused to write a paper contrasting Freud's essays on female development with what the psychoanalytic feminists were doing with Freud, because Freud was a cancer-ridden, cigar-smoking misogynist. This expression of prejudice was not an authentic moment of judging, of course, not least because the student had refused to read the assigned text. She was repeating a prejudice, not forming a judgment. A teacher quickly wearies of this sort of thing because it undermines the presuppositions that guide and help to constitute the pedagogical enterprise, one of the most important of these suppositions being that students are capable of weighing alternatives with a generosity of spirit and quality of discernment that makes their subsequent judgments at least plausible, if not unassailable. I've always been fond of a pithy sentence in a letter Freud wrote to his fiancée, Martha. A human being must be able to pull himself together to form a judgment, otherwise he turns into what we Viennese call a guten Putzen, doormat. Apart from being stepped on, what is the problem with persons as doormats? Precisely this: they have sloughed off that which is theirs to do, to enter a community of judging, meaning that one can see error and try to put it right, one can distinguish the more from the less important, one can appropriately name phenomena and act accordingly. As an example of the latter, think of the distinction to be marked between misfortune and injustice, and what we are enjoined to do when we confront one or the other. Now, Freud was not arguing Martha to be cruel or incapable of compassion or forgiveness. Rather, he was urging her to stiffen her spine a bit, to stand up for herself, and not to shrink from acts of assessment and discernment. Judging involves calling things by their real names, embracing the difficult recognition that what Hannah Arendt calls an enormously enlarged empathy does not in itself suffice to sustain the capacity for that critical thinking we call judging. Arendt had little use for those who treated adults as if they were children by spoon-feeding them palatable truths rather than harder truths of life and politics. If we over-assimilate our situation to that of others and pretend that we are at one with them, we may lose the point at which we leave off and they begin. We are then in danger of losing the faculty of judgment that, for Arendt, consists in thinking the particular and through this concrete act reaching the far more general conclusions and truth. Why is judging, what Arendt called the preeminent political faculty, a nadir among us? Surely much of the explanation lies in the triumph of the ideology of victimization coupled with self-esteem mania. The two are, of course, closely linked. Examples are so numerous it is hard to pick and choose. Take one from the public schools. By now most discerning students are familiar with the studies showing that American school children scored much lower on math accomplishment tests than did their counterparts from several other societies, even while these same Americans were the ones who felt best about their math ability. Here the emphasis on feeling good, by contrast to concrete establishment, results in students being incapable of an accurate discernment of where they really stand on their math ability. Here's a second story from the literary front. My son is an aspiring poet, and he finds increasingly depressing the many moments, whether in class or out, when a poem that is weak in execution and flat in evocative power is embraced as something real and important because it speaks about the poet's own undigested experiences, which by definition can never be assessed and criticized. In other words, the self-referential prejudices of our times swamp a cooler set of criticisms and judgments, and wind up making a triumph of something rather petty. In the process, the work of those young men and women who really struggle with form and language and getting it right is trivialized, their accomplishments discounted. In some circles, if you carefully and precisely criticize a weak poem, you may face censure because the poem and its author's psyche or identity are at one Thus, you find yourself in the position of criticizing her or his life, given the utter collapse of one into the other, when what you really want to do is explain why you think this isn't a very good poem. Now, I'm not reading the essay anymore. This is kind of funny, just because, to me, I remember this very well. And in college, even some of the stuff I had to read in high school, we had to read, based on race, class, and gender. It wasn't always good, and you could not say that it wasn't good. You always had to. I just remember doing my homework and, just praising it because I knew that's what the teacher wanted. And I got an A in those classes. But, did I learn much? We'll leave that for later. Back to the essay. The culture of victimization, then, and the triumph of pop psych notions of self-esteem in contrast to a self-capable of discernment and judging, seems a pretty clear source of our discontents in this matter. Of course, any decent person is concerned about victims, and there are real victims in our less than perfect world. But that is not the issue. An ideology of victimization of the feminist sort casts women as victims of male oppression. From the very beginning of time, indeed, female victimization has taken on foundational status. But this victim ideology diverts attention from concrete and specific instances of female victimization in favor of pushing a relentless worldview structured around such dichotomies as victim, victimizer, guilty, innocent, and tainted and pure. A female victim construed as innocent remains somehow free from sin. Remember Arendt's insistence following Kant that judging is the faculty of thinking the particular. An ideology of victimization, with its harsh and exaggerated polemicism, actually hurts the cause of women's rights, for it provides grounds for callous or sexist individuals to depreciate the claims of actual victims. Victimization ideology is little more than a politics of resentment, given the growing body of evidence demonstrating that women, though they often have been victims of injustice, have played a variety of active roles throughout history and in every culture. Of course, who didn't know that? It is quite incredible that one must make this point against those who, in the name of feminism, promote the generic prejudice that women are victims of simpliciter. Our world is filled with noisy forces urging us to refrain from judging precisely in the name of justice. This dangerous nonsense is evident in every issue of any daily newspaper anywhere. The jurors in the Reginald Denny beating case decided not to convict because the thugs who smashed a man's face to an unrecognizable pulp and exulted for the cameras as if they had just made the winning touchdown at a Super Bowl game were in the grip of a mob psychology and could not therefore be judged for the specific acts of wanton and repeated violence. The Menendez brothers were victims who, although they blasted their parents numerous times with a shotgun, were not to be held accountable. We can't judge them, given what they went through, as one juror put it. Take another case, one worth looking at in some detail. A woman in Nashville, Tennessee starved her infant son to death. Turned into a robot, so it was claimed she was unable to feed the infant even though the husband was away at work all day. Her defense was based on her having been abused by this husband, even though when he got home from work, the two of them would dress up and go out on the town, frequent sleazy bars, looking for men and women for three-way sex. Gross. Meanwhile, a baby is starving to death. Of this terrible story, victimization doctrine holds that as a victim of abuse herself, the woman by definition cannot in turn be victimizing another. I'm just thinking out of context of the essay here. Well, what about pedophiles? It seems like a lot of them were victimized when younger, so is it okay for them to just continue doing what they're doing? No. Anyway, back to the essay. We cannot judge her actions because she is oppressed. According to her lawyers, who are now mounting an appeal, the jury found her guilty has victimized her twice. But one who looks at victimization as a concrete and specific act would argue that, although it is terrible to be abused, For a 23-year-old woman with a range of options open to her, she might have given the infant to her mother to care for, as she had done with an older child. To starve an infant to death is more terrible yet. Surely, to make that assessment is not an act prompted by a harsh desire for revenge. It flows rather from a recognition that we are able to distinguish real victims from rhetorical ones, evil acts and crimes from less serious misdeeds. As the lawyers for this woman said, the woman cannot be held accountable, and to do so is a male deal, or a society deal, but some people just don't get it. Now we are told the perpetrator is a victim, twice or even thrice, of that amorphous entity, society, of her husband, and of the jury that found her guilty. The woman's mother has stepped in, proclaiming that she too is a victim, for she lost a grandson. Notice the language. She lost the grandson, as if he had been misplaced, not knowingly, over a 6-week period, starved to death as he lay, immobile, listless, no longer able to cry, in his own waste in a filthy crib in a locked room as his parents played out their fantasies with male and female prostitutes. Sick. This is nigh unbelievable, but there it is. Even if it is an awful case, gets turned back on appeal, we, all of us, are in danger of being worn down by arguments of this sort. Hence, the more likely it is, at some future point, we will have forgotten what it means to hold this person accountable in this situation for this particular horrible deed. Let's pursue this just a bit further, depressing as it is, because the elimination of the possibility of judgment, the evacuation of the very capacity of judgment, would spell the end of the human subject as a self-respecting, accountable being. Judging is a sign, a mark of our respect for the dignity of others and ourselves. We are surrounded by glorious strategies of exculpation, ways to evade responsibility for a situation or an outcome, should one happen to be a member of an oppressed or victimized group. In the recent book, The Alchemy of Race and Rights, the author, Patricia Williams, plays the victim card to achieve both ends simultaneously. Acknowledging that the Tawana Brawley accusation in the now notorious 1988 scandal were part of a hoax. Who does that remind us of today? Jesse Smollett? Anyway, Williams suggests that that doesn't really matter, for Brawley was a victim of some unspeakable crime no matter how she got there, no matter who did it to her, and even if she did it to herself. Jesse Smollett. Anyway, that is, even if Brawley injured herself, her condition was clearly the expression of some crime against her, some tremendous violence, some great violation that challenges comprehension. Brawley was the victim of a meta-rape, and this secures both her victim status and legitimates the power plays of those who cynically manipulated the situation. These latter escape judgment. Yeah, like George Soros and all those others who helped Smollett. Anyway, I don't know about Soros exactly, but you know what I mean. And Brawley cannot be judged either. But the society that somehow did this to her on a meta level becomes responsible, given the prejudice that in a racist society, all African Americans are victims of the dominant meta-narrative. Consider the alternative view of black responsibility noted by Stephen Carter. We must never lose the capacity for judgment, especially the capacity to judge ourselves and our people. Standards of morality matter no less than standards of excellence. There are black people who commit heinous crimes, and not all of them are driven by hunger and neglect. We are not automatons. To understand all may indeed be to forgive all, but no civilization can survive when the capacity for understanding is allowed to supersede the capacity for judgment. Otherwise, at the end of the line lies a pile of garbage. Hitler wasn't evil, just insane. That's the end of Stephen Carter's quote there, which is quite respectable. Understandable. Anyway, back to the essay. When the capacity for understanding is allowed to supersede the capacity for judgment, let the words linger for a moment. When the capacity for understanding is allowed to supersede the capacity for judgment, then conjure with the teaching of Jesus, judge not that ye not be judged. This, of course, from the Sermon on the Mount. These two are words I grew up with, and I pondered them, wondering if my mother's judgmental attitude was compatible with Jesus' injunction. We are also told, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." We were told to walk around in the other guy's shoes before we judged severely, or before we judged at all. Squaring this with Grandma's decisive Ruski was no easy matter. I sometimes repaired to Lincoln, one of my childhood heroes. I especially loved the magnificent second inaugural, "With malice towards none, with charity towards all." Those words I could square with judgment. Malice and judgment, the punitive and the fair, are not the same. Lincoln had, after all, insisted that the nations were under God's judgment, and our terrible Civil War, the war he was prosecuting in terms of unconditional surrender, was our punishment for chattel slavery. Lincoln was no value-free, laid-back kind of guy, compassion with judgment. This framed his life and work. Judge not is then not an injunction to spineless acceptance, but a caution against peremptory legalisms that leave no space for acts of compassion and witness. I have also found helpful the discussion of the lively British philosopher Mary Midgley in her book, "Can't We Make Moral Judgments?" Midgley notes our contemporary search for a non-judgmental for politics and quotes all those people who cry in effect, but surely it's always wrong to make moral judgments. We are not permitted to make anyone uncomfortable, to be insensitive. Yet moral judgment of some kind, says Midgley, is a necessary element to our thinking. Judging involves our whole nature. It isn't just icing on the cake of self-identity. Judging makes it possible for us to find our way through a whole forest of possibilities. Midgley argues that Jesus was taking aim at sweeping condemnations and vindictiveness. He was not trashing the whole faculty of judgment. And may I insert here, potentially ending nonsense tribalism, like endless warfare and vendettas that you see in all kinds of tribal societies, from the Middle East to the Vikings and all over the place. They had these crazy, you killed my, stepdad, I have to kill your family, and just this never-ending line of revenge that just continues in warfare, and it's just terrible for everyone. And anyway, that's also what I think he's getting at too, is to end that cycle of violence, that insane kind of violence that just doesn't make sense. We have to judge the kind of violence. Anyway, back to the book. So Midgley argues that Jesus was taking aim at sweeping condemnations and vindictiveness. He was not trashing the whole faculty of judgment. Indeed, Jesus is making the subtle point that while we cannot possibly avoid judging, we can see to it that we judge fairly, as we would expect others to do to us. That's important, as we would expect others to do to us. This is part and parcel, then, of justice, as fairness, as a discernment about a particular case and person and deed. Subjectivism in such matters of the "I'm okay, you're okay" variety is a cop-out, a way to stop forming and expressing moral judgments altogether. Don't we see that in society today? This was written a while ago, right? This essay I'm talking about, because I remember having to do an essay on it in high school, and this whole thing has just gotten entirely out of control now. People don't know what to judge. It's like we have Antifa basically working for the state. They say the state says wear masks, and Antifa will show up and enforce it. People they don't like, and we also have other things the government's doing. It seems people just thinks, the government's nice. They're not going to hurt us. Trust pharmaceutical companies. Trust the government. Just trust. No, we need to judge these things, and we'll get to that later. It's just amazing how much this situation hasn't been fixed since I read this a long time ago and thought it was wonderful. And that's why I'm sharing it, because I think this essay is great, just because this is such a huge issue in our society. one that's undermining it. Okay, so back to the book. This is the strange suspension of specific moments of judgment go hand in glove, of course, with an often violent rhetoric of condemnation of whole categories of persons past and present, and that all-purpose villain, the dead white European male, comes to mind. And today, who is it? Those who don't, like pharmaceutical companies doing things to them, mandates and stuff? Oh, those people are to blame. Yeah. Perhaps this is the point at which we might recall Tocqueville's... I'm not so good at French names, so recall Tocqueville's warnings about what sort of despotism democratic nations have to fear. For Tocqueville's worst-case scenario has quite a bit to do with judging, or better put, no longer being able to distinguish the better from the worse, the excellent from the mediocre, slavish from self-responsibility. Democratic despotism, according to Tocqueville, would have a different character from the tyranny of the old world. It would be more widespread and milder. It would degrade men rather than torment them. Thus, Tocqueville sees citizens withdrawing into themselves, circling around one another in pursuit of the petty and banal pleasures with which they glut their souls. Oh, just look at our leaders, isn't that true? Anyway, the exercise of genuine free choice becomes rarer. The activity of free will occurs within a narrower compass, and little by little robs each citizen of the proper use of his own faculties. Yeah, definitely happening. The words Tocqueville used, and feel free to judge me on my pronunciation of this guy's name. I should know how to pronounce it, and I will make sure to do so for the next video. I'm sure I'm off. Tocqueville? I don't know. Not good at French words. Uses to describe this state of things are hinder, restraint, enervate, stultify. Losing over time the faculty of thinking, feeling, and acting for themselves, these citizens slowly fall below the level of humanity. Tocqueville nowhere talks about collapse of the faculty of judgment in a specific sense, but that surely is much of what is at stake. Judging is central to, indeed constitutive of, both our self-identity and our sociality. It helps us to disentangle, analyze, separate, discern, and in so doing puts us smack dab in a world of others, not apart, not above, not below, but among. Told that, if we are powerful, we cannot judge others, but we can only be judged, and on the other hand, that if we are powerless, we can judge totally, but cannot be judged, since the powerful by definition don't get it, we fall into an intellectual laziness that itself is ethically corrupt and corrupting. As Midgley notes, Jesus' message was not, do not stone people, do not cast them out, do not write them off. His target was punitive self-righteousness. With such self-righteousness, now a major cottage industry, are we in the danger zone imagined by Tocqueville? That is the question to which sober reflection on judging leads us, or at least where it should. End of essay. Now I'm just so amazed at how much this whole issue has developed where we are now. Almost 2022. It's nuts. So just a couple questions for reflection, and these questions are by Louis Podgman and Louis Vaughan. One or the other, because this is from a book, and this essay is an excerpt from it. So, question 1, and I'm going to do another essay on these questions, and also let's see what people think about this and analyze all this in light of what's going on today. So, the questions are: why does judging have a bad odor in American culture? 2. Examine Elshtain's reason for being judgmental and for thinking non-judgmentalism is dangerous nonsense. Are they convincing? Explain your answer. Alright, that's it for now. I will be back to talk about this. Thank you for listening, and share this, because at the very least, I'm going to try to link this essay somewhere at least share this essay, because people need to read this kind of thing. And nice thing is I have a lot more great essays like this in my noggin, and just in this book too, to talk about here. So let's do it next. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.